or as how we call up north, we call them the morons. So, that's a long story. Okay, you've got to be from Massachusetts to understand that. You're also the first ones to be lucky enough to see our new technology. We've joined the 21st century. We now have a PC and a monitor to show the presentation, as opposed to putting papers on the wall. So, Mr. Robert Scarlett, if you care to come up here and keep these people awake.
Yeah, really.
Do the best you can.
Hello. Speaking of high tech, let me fire up. This is the first time I'm using a computer for this. I'm like, wow. I've always taught my students, oh, hey. Hello, sister. Oh, wow. I see several of my students here. I didn't even see them come in. So I feel honored. Oh, it's high tech already up here. I missed you guys. Welcome to 2024. It's been a while, hasn't it? When was our last lecture? Wow. You guys got to come back. Where you been? Well, just so you know, as you see, we have a better schedule this time. We're doing 3 months in a row this particular time. Today about the Maroons, in February, in honor of Black History Month, we're doing a lecture called The Journey of African Americans. It's going all the way from Africa through the history of America. So that's I'm still trying to wrap my brain around that one. That's a lot of years to try to figure out what do I really want to talk about. And in March, in honor of Women's History Month, I'm doing a lecture on the impact of women in America, how critical and how important women have been in the history of America. So we don't always stop to appreciate what women have done for this nation, but you know, if you have any sense whatsoever, you realize that none of us could be here without them, right? Think about it. All right, so let's start with a simple question. What would you do? What would you be willing to do to gain your freedom from kidnappers? Think about that. What would you be willing to do to gain your freedom from kidnappers?
Whatever it takes.
Right? So now, let me really get your ire up a little bit. What would you be willing to do to gain your children's freedom from kidnappers? I saw some eyes open up then, right? What are we willing to do to protect the people that we love? And that's really what we're talking about today. We're going to talk about what we would be willing to do to gain freedom for ourselves and for our family. So if you're willing to do the things that went through your mind, I can only imagine all types of illegal things I would do to get my children back. Right? So give that same grace to the men and women we're going to talk about today, what they were willing to do in order to get themselves free and to get their family members free. Think about that for just a little bit. All right. What do enslaved Africans, Native Americans, and South Carolinians, many of them lived here in Dorchester, Colleton County, what do they have in common? It sounds like a setup for a joke, doesn't it? What do they have in common? That's what we're really going to focus on today. They all play an important role in spreading or combating Maroonage in South Carolina. Don't worry, definition's coming. I see some faces. What the heck are you talking about? Let's get down to that part first. What are we talking about? So basic definition of Maroonage. What's a Maroon? Maroons are those who escape slavery. It's the act of running away to form Maroon communities. The actual original word Maroon comes from the Spanish word cimarron, which means wild and untamed, usually assigned to animals, but no surprise that it was assigned to the enslaved Africans who decided, we're not going to do what you want us to do. We're not going to do things the way you want us to do things. The discussion we'll have today was created using research right here in the Somerville Museum and Research Center. So we always like to emphasize this is not just a museum. This is also an academic research center with a lot of research from the area, a lot of books, manuals, manuscripts right upstairs in our research center, including this book you see on the left there, that most of this discussion today, where that actually came from. And it is available to you, the public, by appointment, to come and spend time in the research center. All right? Think about it. There are things you may not have known or may be curious about where you live at. I heard a few people that are not originally from Somerville came here. In case you can't tell by the way I talk, I'm not from here. I'm from Philly. Yeah, like, oh my goodness, there's a Yankee up in here. A carpetbagger. Yes, I did 30 years in the military, and I retired here at Charleston Air Force Base in 2014. So my family, we've been here in Somerville since 2009. That's when we first got here. So my kids graduated here. I teach here. I'm a high school teacher. Some of my students are here. Good job getting your extra credit. From Fort Dorchester High School, they're here as well. So they get to listen to me for about 45 minutes or so. They're like, man, we do it all the time. You have to listen to you some more? But yes, that is where I am originally from. But my passion is to learn more and teach more about mainly the African American history of an area. So when I was asked by a friend of mine, it was another chief master sergeant, who was on the board here at the museum, like, look, we need you to come here. We have a lot of history, but nobody talks about our history in South Carolina. So if you guys are interested, and I see a lot of new faces, we may have to redo some of those lessons we've done in the past that you have missed. Because raise your hand if you had no idea that the Buffalo Soldiers were stationed here.
What?
That the Buffalo Soldiers were stationed here. Right? Didn't know that. Did you know that the first black members of the Union Army was not the 54th Massachusetts? It was the 1st South Carolina Volunteers. Also here in Somerville. You heard that before? No. That's why I'm here. That's why I'm here. So I love that type of history. You know, South Carolina was the first state that established a public school system. Right? After the Civil War. All these things that we learn and talk about that's interesting, especially for the folks that lived their whole life here and never heard most of this stuff. Right? So I think you're going to talk about something today that you probably never heard of. So let's start with that. Raise your hands if you've never heard of the Maroons. All right, only a few hands. So my students don't count because they hear about it in class. Before this year started, did you hear about the Maroons? Okay, I didn't think so. That's funny. Okay, so we got the definition down. Wild and untamed. You now know that this is a research center and not just a maroon. A museum. So Maroons met in the wilderness and formed primitive communities. Right? Communities arose as early as the 1540s in Cuba and San Domingo and Dominican Republic. By the 17th century, they emerged in South America, in Central America, in the Brazilian jungles, the swamps in the forests of Suriname, and the mountains of Jamaica. These are early places before slavery even came here to America, obviously. The largest and most enduring Maroon communities in the French territory occurred in Saint-Domingue, today known as Haiti. And that's where we make our first connection to us here in the United States. Anybody have any idea how the Maroons in Haiti contributed to one of the best things we ever got here in the United States?
Resistance.
Resistance, that's definitely an important aspect of it, but there's something tangible that we can thank them for that you probably never even thought about. Because I teach U.S. history. I've been teaching U.S. history for a decade, and I haven't seen this stuff in my history books. So there's a lot of things that have happened, a lot of things that America has benefited from that are not well known to those of us that just get our knowledge through the public school system. Okay. Enjoy my technology. Try not to forget that. Okay. Although historians differ, the role of Maroons in the Haitian Revolution of 1791 is undisputable. So the Haitian Revolution, anybody ever heard of that before? All right. Haitian Revolution. Basically, Haiti, or Saint-Domingue at the time, was a French colony belonging to their leader, Napoleon Bonaparte, at the time. So the 500,000 enslaved people in Saint-Domingue started to count. And what I mean by they started to count, it's like 500,000 of us. There's 25,000 of them. Why are we listening to them? Good question, right? Why are we being ruled by them? And so they rose up. In August of 1791, something known as the Night of Fire. It's called that because they set 900 slave plantations on fire. 900. Can you imagine how bright it was at night during that time? So we're thinking, okay, that happened in Haiti. What does that have to do with us? Well, as I said, that colony was owned by the French. And the French at the time, they were already at war with the English and battling the Spanish. So like, we don't have the money we need to send troops to Haiti, or Saint Domingue at the time, to put down this slave rebellion. Where are we going to get this money from? Well, there just happened to be a president in the United States in 1803 by the name of Thomas Jefferson. And Thomas Jefferson sent envoys to France and said, hey, we need to get our trade out through the port of New Orleans down the Mississippi River. So in order to do that, we're having so much problems with you guys not letting us through the port. How about you just sell us New Orleans? We will give you $10 million for the port of New Orleans. That's all we need. That way we can get our ships out, we can go on about our business. Little did Jefferson know that Napoleon was hard up for money at the time. So Napoleon was like, boy, do I have a deal for you. Instead of giving you that little dot on the map there, right? Basically, this little area right down here, instead of giving you that little dot on the map there for $10 million, how about if I give you all of this for $15 million? And in our history books, that is known as the Louisiana Purchase. So we doubled the size of our nation because of the actions of African Americans who no longer wanted to be enslaved. So this is where we Americans say, thank you. We appreciate doubling the size of our nation through your resistance efforts. Anybody ever heard that in school? No. No connection whatsoever between Louisiana Purchase and the leadership of Toussaint Louverture and the slave uprising in Haiti. I love history. I love history. And really what I love about it is just when we learn more about our own nation and all of those that participated in making our nation great, we get a better appreciation for the diversity, right? We can say that everyone contributed to us being great, how we got to be the way we are. Okay, I will get off my soapbox there for a minute. I can do that for a good minute. Okay, how did Maroons get started here in North America? Spanish were the first Europeans to establish themselves in the New World. And the first thing, they were the first ones to bring enslaved Africans. Never thought about that, right? No. Thought the English did it. Nope. Spanish were the first to bring enslaved Africans into America. How did they get here? Why? They soon started escaping, and if the why was these Africans that they brought. Do I want to do this? I do want to do this, don't I? Because I got like 5 of my students here. 6 of my students here. So y'all can tell these good people the name of that early African that came with the Spanish as a translator.
Ladinos.
Huh?
Ladinos.
No, the person's name.
Oh.
Estevanico?
Estevanico. A+ for Jacob there. Estevanico, right? And you also had another named Esteban the Moor. And they were brought over with the Spanish because they were excellent guides and translators. They helped make that connection between the Spanish and the indigenous Native Americans, whether here or in present-day Mexico, right? That used to be the Aztec territory. So they were guides. One of them was enslaved, Estevanico. The other was a free man, Esteban, that traveled along with them and was paid as a guide. So those were your early Africans in America in as early as the 1500s. So the first of us did not contribute here at the rolling off of slave ships in Charleston. We've been here for quite a while. Okay? But even those early slaves with the Spanish, anytime you have slavery anywhere in the world, it's going to result in some folks wanting to get out of slavery, right? Folks trying to escape. So those early ones started to escape, and they formed those early Maroon communities by hooking up with the Native Americans. That's why, although most of us is lying, that's why most African Americans claim, you know, I'm part Indian. Right? My parents used to tell me that all the time. You know, my dad said, well, we're from the Cherokee tribe. My mom said, we're from the Shoshone tribe. Ancestry.com said, no, you ain't. Right? Telling all these stories all my life, and then, yeah, a little spit in a cup, send it off to some scientists, like, yeah, your parents lied to you, bro. I'm sorry. Good story, though. It does say, like, less than 2% indigenous, so it could be some of that story could be correct. But that is interesting how DNA is messing up a lot of family stories. Whether you look at that as being good or bad. So these Maroons survived by trading with nearby settlers for guns and tools. If necessary, Maroons raided plantations and took what they need. Understandably so. See, I was fascinated to learn during my research how Maroons and local slaves developed important trade relationships. In this case, Maroons provided for their communities, but they also provided items that helped slaves avoid punishment. Okay, how do we get there? How do we get from trade? How's trade going to help you avoid punishment? Right? So just go with me on this one. You see, some of the Maroons made shingles to trade with the enslaved who may not have made enough shingles to meet their master's quota. And if you watched any of these thousands of slavery movies that have been out, you see what happens when an enslaved person did not meet their quota. Right? That's where the whippings and all that kind of stuff came in. So they would trade items with these Maroons who would provide them with the shingles to bring their numbers back up. Say, hey, I produced as many as I was supposed to help them avoid punishment. I find that fascinating. Right? I find that a fascinating relationship. Prevent military attacks, Native Americans helped Maroons select the best locations that were both defensible and had a ready supply of fresh water. In case, you know, I know our education system does not always do us the most justice, but in case you didn't know, this land belonged to the American Indian long before it belonged to us. They knew the land. They understood the land. They knew how to survive off the land. So when you had the Africans escaping and running across these American Indian communities, they're like, look, bro, I know what it feels to be oppressed by the Europeans. Let me help you out. Let me help set you up, show you how to do this. Right? Because when you think about it, you just escaped. You don't know the land. You don't know how to get food. You don't know where you want to set up camp at. But you get these people, and it made it a lot easier for those transitioning into what we label as Maroonage. All right, let me take a moment to distinguish between enslaved Africans who simply escaped, who just wanted to get away for a while. A lot of them came right back, right? Got hungry and came right back. So how do we distinguish between those folks and others to earn the name Maroon? What is it about those that get to be Maroons? Unlike others who escaped, some escaped simply to heal. When I learned about that, I never thought about it or realized it. Some of these punishments are so harsh that there's no way you're going to heal if you're right back out in the field working the next day. Especially here in South Carolina, because a lot of that labor was in the rice paddies. And you're not going to be in that knee-deep water and mud and heal up from the beating you got. So some would actually escape just long enough to heal up and return to be able to work at full capacity. Never learned that before. That was an interesting find for me. And you can thank who I call the lead historian here at the museum, Dr. West, Dr. Ed West, who couldn't make it here today. Normally he's here. And he was sharing that with me, and I'm like, I didn't know that aspect of it. I find that very, very interesting. I love to learn, plain and simple. I love to learn. All right, so they set out to form independent communities in the South that were self-sufficient and could exist outside of a system of government. You obviously don't want to be needing, the government to help you out with anything if you're hiding in the woods or in the swamps trying to avoid that government. So they had to be able to set up those self-sustaining governments. So the image you see here, we're going to talk about Fort Mose. And now we're really bringing it even closer. Let's get down to South Carolina. Where does this come in with South Carolina? So one of the largest early Maroon communities was intentionally created due to the Spanish hatred of the British. The Spanish and the British. Because early on, when you think about that map that I showed you, okay, when we gained Louisiana Purchase after the Haitian Revolution, if you notice, the rest of that land wasn't ours yet. Who did it belong to? The French and the Spanish, right? That's who we had to work with for land. And Florida was simply the Spanish. And Florida back then included Alabama, a lot more land than Florida actually contains today, right? And so the Spanish hated the English. So the Spanish did everything they could to hurt the profitability of the English. So they encouraged those enslaved by the English to escape to Florida, where they would grant them their freedom. If you got here to Florida, you would be okay. Get away from them. And it was not a love for African people. It was, let's stick it to the English. Let's do whatever we can to stick it to the English. And sometimes it really is. It's that simple. How can we hurt our enemy? So what the Spanish did in the late 1730s, they permitted runaways to form their own Maroon community, and they established what was known as Fort Mose. Fort Mose was a community, call it a fort, entire community of just escaped Africans and their families. But there was a condition. Of course, we hate the English, but that's not the only benefit we're going to get out of this. So those men that escaped had to join the Spanish military. So not only are we going to stick it to the English by taking their property, we're going to literally stick it to the English by you guys helping us fight them, fighting the wars against them. So this also is going to lead to one of the most significant events in pre-colonial, or really colonial, South Carolina. As you know, South Carolina started out as a colony under Great Britain, right? So that's how we started. While we were a colony under Great Britain, that's when this was going on with Fort Mose. Right? So how do we make the connection to South Carolina? So after they fought along with the Spanish, one of the main reasons why the British invaded Florida was because of a slave rebellion known as the Stonewall Rebellion. The Stonewall Rebellion happened here because of Fort Mose. So you had a group of enslaved Africans led by a man by the name of Jimmy. Started out with 20 of them. I want you to keep this in mind. Anybody know the name of the square outside this door? Hutchinson Square. Well, Jimmy led 20 enslaved Africans to Hutchinson's store. Same family. Hutchinson's store, attacked the store, killed the two owners that were inside, chopped their heads off, placed their heads on the front steps of the store. They weren't playing, and they wasn't hiding. Placed their heads on the front steps of that store. Took guns, ammunition, and they were traveling from South Carolina trying to make their way down Highway 17. If you know anything about that area, now Highway 17 today, beating drums, trying to attract more enslaved people to join them. So at their full force, they had up to 100 enslaved rebels in their party, all marching down Highway 17 And if anybody knows this, I'm still trying to find this. In the history it says they were marching down Pon Pon Road. I know there's a Pon Pon Chapel out there, but if anybody can tell me where Pon Pon Road was. I was out there a couple of weeks ago, going down Highway 17, they got a historic marker for the Stoner Rebellion and all that type of stuff, so I traveled around like, where is Pon Pon Road? So if anybody discovered that, look the brother up. Let me know where Pon Pon Road was. So I like to walk the paths of the ancestors whenever I can. Go out there and actually be in those areas. Okay? So we did a lecture here at the museum about a year ago about the Stoner Rebellion. With all these new faces, you guys can demand it again. Pam is very receptive to anything that's going to bring more folks out here. All right? So ask for it. And actually, we probably should put out a list of all the lectures we've already done. The reason why I say that is I see so many new faces that have never heard any of these previous lectures that you guys might want a little recap or have us do those again. All right, so fear of additional rebellions led South Carolina to amend its existing slave codes, introducing the 1740, I love the name of this congressional legislation, the Bill for the Better Ordering and Governing of Negroes and Other Slaves in the Province. That was the name of the bill that came out of the Stoner Rebellion. So it's also known as the 1740 Slave Act. Called the Negro Act by many people, a direct response to the Stoner Rebellion. Almost every aspect of the enslaved lives were changed because of this legislation. You know, there was a time, and we don't think about this, we talk about how the enslaved were not allowed to learn how to read and write, right? But that wasn't always the case. In the beginning, they were reading and writing. In fact, it was these slave owners who were teaching them to read and write. Why? Why would I pay for a secretary when I own one? Why would I pay for an accountant when I own one? So these folks were keeping the books. They were helping run the businesses, right? They were assistant managers, you could say. But after this, the fear of passing around notes and organizing a rebellion made it illegal to use your enslaved laborers as what they called scribes. It became illegal to teach them how to write so they can keep your records. That became a crime. And I'm sure you probably also understand why it became a crime for an enslaved person to own a drum. Right? So that drum was a rallying call. You beat on that drum, gather folks up. So any noise-making type stuff, horns and so forth, they were not allowed. Have you ever heard of step dancing or stepping? A lot of college fraternities do that. Where did that come from? When they took away the drum, they learned to use their bodies to create sounds. That's where stepping originated. It's a way for them to continue to enjoy the beats and using their body instead of the drums that were now illegal. So Maroonage in the South was also motivated by new laws. Northern states didn't remain sanctuaries for runaway slaves. If they could get to the north, you're all good. Well, suddenly, that changed. Anybody know what changed it?
Fugitive slave law?
The Fugitive Slave Act. Fugitive Slave Act. Fugitive Slave Act did not just say running away is bad. Runaways should return. Slave catchers, you can go north and capture your runaways. No. It made it a law that the U.S. government had to capture slaves. It became a crime for a citizen who knew that someone was an escaped slave for them not to arrest them and turn them in. It became a crime. So you think about how hard it wasn't just on the lives of those escaped Africans. Think about how hard it was on those white abolitionists. Those who dedicated their lives to protecting, or something that we can, I won't get off track. My students don't know how to get off track. Yeah.
They could also lose their property.
Yep.
Could be like drug laws now, you can lose everything you own. The abolitionists could lose everything they own. Which I think makes you think twice about stepping up.
Yeah, it does, right? It does. How much are you really willing to risk yourself? It's one thing to look the other way. It's another thing when looking the other way becomes a federal crime. Yes, sir.
It sounds like Nazi Germany, where people were hiding Jews.
Yes, very much so. Right? Very much so. Great connection, sir. Thank you. Excellent connection. Anyone ever heard of the Great Dismal Swamp? Have you ever been there? I've never been there. Have you ever been there? Is it?
Drove through.
Drove through it. Is it really dismal? Is it that bad? So that's a cool name, though. The Great Dismal Swamp. Right? That's a cool name. I want to go there just for that. Okay? So Great Dismal Swamp, the border between Virginia and North Carolina, acted as a strong magnet for runaway slaves. The number of Maroons in the Great Dismal Swamp can only be guessed at, but historians have it up to as many as 1,000. 1,000 hiding in the Great Dismal Swamp. And we'll talk more about why as we go into it. So Maroonage in South Carolina was more common than in other parts of North America. One of the main reasons is because the origin story of the enslaved themselves in South Carolina. Many of the enslaved in South Carolina started their journey on the continent of Africa. Many of them started further away than some others. In North America, many of the enslaved were American-born, as opposed to other parts of the world where a large number of enslaved were African-born. So when you think about it, there were only a few, maybe 150, 200,000, somewhere around there, of enslaved brought into the United States. But by the Civil War, there was 4 million of us. How did that happen? Kids come first. You know, it happened naturally. Right? Naturally, in some cases, cruelly. I won't get into the slave breeding sites that were throughout America. I'll let you look that one up on your own. I don't want to bring anybody down. But yes, they were breeding sites for slaves. This helps explain why Maroonage was more popular in South Carolina compared to Virginia. Many more of the enslaved that came into South Carolina came in directly from the continent of Africa. South Carolina continued to import enslaved Africans directly from Africa as late as 1807, with 40,000 arriving in Charleston between 1803 and 1807, just before the federal government banned the importation of enslaved Africans from other countries in 1808. That's when it became illegal. They didn't end slavery. It was no longer allowed to bring enslaved in from other countries. So that really made the domestic slave trade in America very, very, very important as they moved around throughout the United States. This is why the new International African American Museum was built in Charleston. Many enslaved Africans, after enduring the horrors of the Middle Passage, if you don't know what that is, look, I'll give you the quick version of it. Got on the ships in Africa, the long journey from Africa to, let's say, Charleston, and the horrors that they endured on those ships during that journey. That's the Middle Passage. Being stuck in the bottom of a slave ship for a couple of months at a time, lying on a wooden rack, stacked one on top of the other. So, you guys have already had lunch. But so imagine the person on the top bunk gets sick. Or when the person on the top bunk has to relieve themselves, because they're chained down there for days at a time. There's no bathroom facilities. It really sucks to be the person on the bottom on one of those ships. That's probably why 20% of all of the occupants of slave ships didn't make it to America. To the point where sharks followed all the slave ships. Because they knew they'd be fed regularly. So when they died, they just tossed them overboard. Right? So that's the horrors of the Middle Passage. Many of those journeys ended right here in Charleston, South Carolina. Charleston received more enslaved Africans than any other port in the entire United States. Doesn't come close. And that's why that museum, International African American Museum, is built at the site, Gadsden's Wharf, at the site where those ships came in. That's why that museum is where it's at. That's where the ships came in. That's where the ships docked. If you haven't been there, as you can see, it backs right up to the water. There's still an operating dock there, tour boats and things like that coming into there. So when you go in there, and even if you don't want to pay money, that whole bottom section you see underneath the museum, that's all outside. You don't have to pay for that. Some nice displays down there. Right underneath here, and you can't really tell by this picture, they have about 3 inches of water, and underneath it, it has a display of the routes of the slave ships coming in. So that's very interesting. It has labels on docks and so forth. So you don't have to pay money to go walk around underneath the museum and see some of the things that they have there. So it's known as Gadsden Wharf. I had a very interesting conversation a couple weeks ago with a teacher. I don't even know if you know this prophet, but Mr. Gadsden is the great-grandson of the Gadsdens. Did you know that? Yeah. Gadsden flag with the snake. So he has a whole history of his grandfather with the Gadsden family. They own three plantations in Charleston. And he points out, he says, well, we had already sold the wharf by the time they started using it for the slave ships to come in. I'm like, relax, bro, it ain't your fault. You weren't alive back then. I'm interested that you guys have this history. Tell me more about it, right? I invited him here, but he's not here. But maybe we can get together a little later, because I'd love to learn more about his family, that history. So yeah, you have something else to talk to Mr. Gadsden about. It's a very, very interesting family history. So why does this matter in this discussion? Studies of Maroonage elsewhere in America suggest that freeborn Africans were much more likely to want to escape than those who were born as enslaved people. Those who once knew freedom, they knew they wanted it back. Those that were born into slavery, it's like, well, that's just my life, right? I was raised here on a plantation. It's just what we do. This is us as a people. But those that were dragged here from the continent, they're like, no, this is not what life is supposed to be. So they were much more likely to be rebellious, much more likely to escape and become Maroons than those that were born in the United States. So for example, the use of fortified camps, like we see in Maroon communities, was common tactics in African warfare. Add to the fact that many enslaved Africans became enslaved as a result of being captured in tribal wars. One of the things when African American history class I used to teach when I was out in La Crosse, and I had a lot more white students, and they would all kind of feel good about themselves and start cheering. Because one of the first things I say during the first week of that class is, stop blaming white people for slavery. We had slavery in Africa for thousands of years before they came along. Okay? And most of the enslaved that ended up in the United States were sold to Europeans by African kingdoms. That's the way it happened. You did not have white people running into the jungle, kidnapping black people by the hundreds and thousands and bringing them to America. No. No. They only had to park their boat on the docks and buy them and load them up. That's as much as they had to do, or pay kingdoms to do that. That's the real history of slavery in America, how they got here. And a lot of people don't like to talk about that. That don't make Africa look very good. But it often came down to you or me. My kingdom going to survive, or is your kingdom going to survive? And quite often what determined which kingdom survived is which kingdom traded for firearms first. The ones with the guns got to remain a kingdom. The ones without got to become enslaved, quite often. The gun has changed history so often all over the world. So that's what really made the difference for who became a Maroon and who did not become a Maroon. All right, nevertheless, freeborn or not, the enslaved experienced harsh, repressive regimes here in America. Those rice plantations in South Carolina, whippings, rapes, maimings, these things were common. Any surprise that people want to get away from that? When you've been kidnapped and you're living in that existence, when you have to watch your children go through that, you're going to be very motivated to try to get them out of that situation. So no one should be surprised by that. But why the swamps? When freedom in the North was so much more appealing. Why the swamps? Well, when you think about that, I want you to think about it from where we are. We are in South Carolina, okay? So the enslaved of South Carolina who don't want to be in South Carolina, where do they go? Where are they going to go? And how are they going to get there? And what do they know about what's around them? So the enslaved who escaped from northern tiers, like Virginia, Kentucky, Maryland, or in the West, they're more likely to be successful because they were in close proximity to states where slavery was prohibited. Not South Carolina. No matter what direction you go in South Carolina, you're going to hit another slave state. So if you manage to get out of your slave state, welcome to my slave state. So now you got to try to get out of here. So despite when we talk about things like the Underground Railroad, that did not happen a lot in South Carolina. But we get to talk about now how it did occur in South Carolina, right here in what used to be Colleton County. But that, you have to think about that. It wasn't that simple. I love when, in the beginning of my courses, I always have students, and it's you can't help but laugh and understand. They're kids. Their mind is a little different. Man, if I was a slave, man, I told that dude, no, I ain't picking that up. Man, you picked that up yourself. Man, you saw me. I'm getting out of here, man. Forget y'all. Get out of your mind, man. You do that yourself, man. They all say, no, that's what I would do. Right? Like, okay. First time that whip hit you, whoosh, where you want that at? They didn't do it because they liked doing it, right? They just didn't like the consequences of not doing it. Anybody that's a parent can understand that philosophy, because I think my parents really took that whipping thing seriously from slavery to modern day. They were really good at it, right? But still, that was control. That was control through pain, through threats. You know, are you going to be able to survive if you don't comply with what you're being told to do? All right. So the swamps were appealing for another reason as well. White soldiers were rarely skilled in guerrilla warfare and were more likely to succumb to diseases themselves as opposed to successfully finding a Maroon community and capturing them. That's one of the things that made the Haitian Revolution so successful. It wasn't that Toussaint Louverture or Charles Dessalines or those great leaders in Haiti who just got great military minds. The vast majority of the soldiers in Haiti died of malaria. The mosquitoes kicked their butts. Realistically, it wasn't a great military victory, it was a great insect victory. They were dying because of the mosquitoes, which is good for those trying to escape. But yeah, you have to think about your environment and how that makes a difference. Okay, so if you're not used to going out to some of these swampy areas in South Carolina, I'm sure some of you know where they are, may have even been out in some of them, it's not an easy way to live. So in the swamps, these fugitives lived in relative security and plenty, building themselves cabins, planting corn, raising hogs and fowl, which they stole from their neighbors. And naturally, hunting was free out there in the woods. So according to Timothy James Lockley, who edited the book Maroon Communities of South Carolina, which most of this research is based on from our research center upstairs, for slaves to form a successful Maroon community in Americas, they needed to fulfill 6 criteria. First, slaves needed to live in relative close proximity to areas such as swamps, forests, jungles, or mountains that were simultaneously inaccessible to regular troops. In fact, we probably still have some of those spots in Dorchester County today, right? Kind of hard to get to. Second, Maroon settlements needed to be readily defensible by a small number of armed men with limited entrances and disguised pathways to prevent accidental discovery. Now, whenever I think about this, I don't know if any of you have had that pop in your head, but whenever I think about it, when I started studying the Maroons, I started thinking Robin Hood and his merry men. Right? Hiding in the forest. Just a thought. Maybe no one else had that thought. But that's what I think about. Third, the Maroons needed to be sufficiently numerous to sustain themselves either through natural reproduction or through raiding. So this is going to go on for generations. You got to have some kids to keep it going. Right? I always struggle with bringing kids into that world at that time. So I guess the desire to replicate yourself was stronger than that other desire. But I always wonder about that. Would I had children voluntarily during that time period to live the life that I had lived?
How could you avoid it at that time?
Yeah, very true. Sometimes, now, I'm sure you mean that as literally as I've taken it.
She does.
Right? As literally as I've taken it. What she's referring to is quite often. I remember, anybody ever remember, you guys, or most of you guys are old enough to remember Jimmy the Greek. Yeah, sportscaster Jimmy the Greek. Remember why he got fired?
Yeah.
He got fired for telling the truth.
Yeah.
He got fired for telling the truth. So for you young folks who never heard of Jimmy the Greek, Monday Night Football. And he used to be the guy who helped with like fantasy football today. Help your odds with who's going to do well, what would you put your bets on, and so forth. So he said, well, you have to understand that these guys are such great athletes because they took a big black male slave and a big black female slave, and they forced them to come together so they can have stronger field hands. And those are the guys we're seeing out on the field today. That was the last we saw of Jimmy the Greek on television.
When was that?
Oh, that was back in the 80s, early 70s, late 70s. Yeah. But he told the truth, right? He told the truth, or what they used to do. It may not be the guys on the field today, but that's where he went a little too far, is making that connection. But he told the truth. That's what they did quite often. Like breeding animals. And try to build the strongest stock you possibly can. Because whatever children they had, it's just more workers for you. All right, fourth, they need to have somewhere to grow food, since even in the jungle there was not enough to live on by hunting alone. Fifth, they needed to have at least some access to plantation society for trading purposes, particularly for weapons. And sixth, they needed to come to some sort of accommodation with white society. I found this one interesting that in my research you find a lot of states where they would have a treaty between these larger Maroon communities and the white community. We will leave y'all alone if y'all promise not to accept any more runaways. We won't come after you as long as you don't accept any more. You guys are established, y'all stay out there, we're trying to fight y'all, but you gotta promise. And if anybody comes your way, you must turn them in. So that's the deal that some of these Maroon communities made in order to survive. How many turn people in? I don't know. I have the same expression that you have when you think about, we escaped, now we're gonna turn these guys back. Yeah, it's kind of like teaching early immigration in America, right? Those early immigrants get successful, y'all can't come in. That was us 10 years ago, but no, we're full. You guys can't come in. That's a whole different lesson. Okay, time to bring this discussion even closer to home. While Maroonage existed in all the southern colonies, it reached its greatest extent here in South Carolina. South Carolina was unique in having a majority slave population. Some areas of South Carolina, 80–90% of the population were enslaved Africans. Here in Charleston was 60% enslaved Africans. So the majority were black. That is why, as I talk to my students about, that is why when the Civil War ended and we entered a period of Reconstruction and blacks could vote, the majority of the state house, your state representatives were black. Most black got a chance to vote. Now you see why they stripped that away as fast as they could. Like, oh yeah, that was we went a little too fast. we gotta go back a little bit. This is happening too fast. But I'm also proud to say that they were the ones that passed the first public school education bill. That black-dominated state house in Columbia. Okay. As I discussed earlier, South Carolina's slave population was less assimilated into American culture, having a higher proportion of African-born slaves. Geography of South Carolina also encouraged maroonage. Tidal rivers used for growing rice, very close to the large swamps that were not under cultivation. So not all of that wetlands were used for rice. Some were not cultivated. Great areas where you can go and hide. These swamps were densely forested with cypress trees, making any attempt to traverse them on horseback difficult. I don't know if you know much about cypress trees, but they're the ones with those little knees coming up out of the ground. Try to get a horse through there, all right? So that's where you hide the protection of nature. You're not going to get horses back in there. That was very important. They were home to large numbers of alligators and rattlesnakes. I had to keep this pretty, that big boy there. And that's actually Cypress Gardens.
Oh, yeah.
In case you don't know, that's Cypress Gardens. So if you go to Cypress Gardens, you might see that big fella there. It was weird when Cypress Garden struck in a storm and it was drained out. Going back there with no water was weird. It was really, really weird being back there. But so now you can appreciate it when it is in its full glory. To the enslaved population of South Carolina, however, these swamps offered a tempting refuge where they could carve out life, living free, while living under their own control. That was the beauty of that. The origins of South Carolina, I'm going to go really back to South Carolina for you, make it easy to understand why it was so popular for maroonage. South Carolina was a slave colony from day one, in case you don't know that. South Carolina was established in 1670. Why was that the case? Many of the lords proprietors, there were 8 lords proprietors, land given by King Charles II, like we're standing right now, or sitting for many of us, and land that used to belong to Lord John Colleton, or Sir, get it correctly, Sir John Colleton. Right? So that's where Colleton County comes from. These guys, these early ones they were members of what was called the Royal Africa Company, which shipped thousands of Africans around the world. That's why they got so many enslaved in South Carolina. They were part of the company that did that. But here's a second large proportion of early settlers in Charlestown, which it was originally called, and what is now South Carolina, came from Barbados. So those early inhabitants of Charlestown came from Barbados. Who encouraged them to come here? A guy by the name of Lord Ashley Cooper. Yeah, Ashley River. Cooper River. Ashley Phosphate Road. In case you don't know, Ashley Phosphate Road is called that because it used to connect to Ashley's phosphate mines. That was a road to connect to where they mined the phosphate. Okay? So these names are not just there for no reason. It's the beauty of learning the history of South Carolina. Over the first couple of years, settlers brought their enslaved Africans with them from Barbados, which was the most profitable Caribbean colony for Great Britain. Okay? Nowadays, we think about Barbados, we think about Rihanna. Right? That's where she's from. More surprising facts that I learned in this research. That I just love doing this stuff because I like knowing what I don't know. Right? It's just fun to learn new things, at least for me anyway as a historian. So raising cattle was the colony's first large-scale endeavor. While Barbadians were familiar with cattle, Africans were more experienced in herding cattle on open grasslands. As my students learned, farming was created in Africa. Africans were the first farmers. They created the concept of farmers. They created the concept of domesticated cattle. In case you don't know that. Slave labor soon replaced whites in the herding of swine and cattle, swine being pigs, if you don't know. On the open range, black cattle hunters rounded up herds, drove them to pens where cattle were separated for slaughter. Cattle drives, cattle branding, and cowboys, which comes from slave being called the cowboy, were part of the colony more than 150 years before the practice existed in the American West. Didn't know that, did you? South Carolina got so many firsts that you don't think about. That's what I love. Just one of the reasons why I settled here is the history. I love the history here. There's no better place for a historian. All right, that's a little bit of history. That was free. I'm not going to charge you for that. Some rural communities most likely started small. A handful of slaves perhaps ran away together or were met by chance in the swamps and determined they were going to live as a group. South Carolina swamps were often inundated with water. There were normally some permanently dry areas. And those are the areas where they were able to plant. They were able to do their planting out in those areas. Vegetables and corn mainly. Climate was rarely too cold. That's another reason why I'm not in Philly anymore. I love walking around like this in January. I was in Baltimore last weekend at the Ravens-Steelers game in Baltimore. I'm a Steelers fan. We lasted a quarter and a half. And it wasn't just the cold, it was freezing rain. And I had my 77-year-old mother-in-law at the game. So I had to get her out of there. I didn't want anything to happen to her. I'm like, you're ready to leave, right? It's cold for you, right? I think we should get you home. She's like, yeah, I need to go. Like, yeah, let's get you home. I was definitely ready to go. So me, my wife, and her mom, yeah. We got angry the next day. It was beautiful the next day. It was beautiful. How come we have that on game day? Okay. Rural communities, like I said, started small. South Carolina swamps were places where they could actually grow food. Once community was established, it didn't take long for folks to find out about it and start flocking to those communities as they escaped. So for a community to become viable in the long term, it required women. Isn't that like the world? For the world to remain viable, it requires women. Right? So yeah, it required women as well as men. Several communities contain both sexes, even children. These communities were clearly intended to be permanent settlements, offering an alternative life for the enslaved in South Carolina. But Maroons could not hide forever. While food could be grown, water was abundant, shelter readily fashioned, they couldn't make metal goods. Needed knives, pots for catching, killing, cooking game. There was no way to replenish shot and powder staying in the woods or in the swamps. The more cautious Maroons obtained these items by trading with slaves on nearby plantations. But if that wasn't possible, they just simply took what they wanted by force. Think about the Stonewall Rebellion, right? Hutchinson Store. What happened there? Runaways, well, I love this part. South Carolina was desperate to find some punishment that would dissuade the enslaved from seeking freedom. Can there possibly be punishment enough to dissuade someone from escaping from that life, from that environment? But it became unsustainable because runaways were charged with the crime of property theft. So at the time, we lived under what was called chattel slavery, where the enslaved were not human beings. They were property owned by the enslaver. No difference between them and the cow and the carriage and the horse. No difference. So when they stole themselves, they were charged with theft. So they figured, I know this is how we're going to solve this whole issue of those wanting to escape. We will make that crime a capital offense. So they did. They changed the law, but it quickly became unsustainable because as they were killing these Africans that escaped, they had to pay the owners money for killing their property instead of returning it to them. So soon South Carolina was going broke because they wouldn't stop running away, and the law said we got to kill them, and then we got to pay the landowner. So yeah, we got to cancel that law. That ain't working too good. Ain't working too good. Next, they tried sending slaves out of the state. You try to run away and get captured, we're going to kick you out of South Carolina. But then they started realizing more decided to run away, thinking, you're going to kick me out of South Carolina if I try to run away? Please? So they were like, okay, that ain't work. We got to try something else. That didn't work either. So what would it finally take for South Carolina to have some success in combating maroonage? This is where the Native American part of our story comes in. One of my least favorite parts, because I love me some Native Americans. I'm 1.5%. 1774, South Carolina government authorized the use of Natchez Indians to hunt Maroons. This tribe was encamped near Four Hole Swamp in Dorchester County, the current location of Francis Bidler Forest. There's plenty of evidence of Maroon communities in Dorchester County. In fact, Francis Bidler Forest was recently recognized as a location where Maroon communities existed, and the forest has officially been designated as a stop on the Underground Railroad. Want to add anything?
I don't. You captured it very well.
Okay. So when I was there, me and another member of this museum, Ken Battle, we went up there. We met with Congressman James Clyburn. And he was there to recognize, I think it was the 3rd anniversary, celebration of the 3rd anniversary of Bidler Forest being recognized as a stop on the Underground Railroad. So now what they're also trying to do, and I would love to hear if you have any updates on this, identifying those maroon sites and maybe establishing signage or something. Can you touch on that?
We're trying to, in a landscape that inherently changes, it's somewhat difficult. I think we're more sort of trying to identify, Matt, I work at Francis Bidler Forest, the types of locations that they most likely would have used in terms of those that were in close proximity to water but were not frequently flooded.
Right.
And then also had like sources of cover where they could build encampments but get away quickly if they needed to. But we're constantly looking for any sort of remaining like physical evidence.
Right.
And the other thing I will point out that I think makes it the most unique in my mind is that the forest is still original growth, so it looks like it would have looked
Right.
200 years ago, 500 years ago, so you can sort of envision it.
If you've never been out to the Francis Bidler Forest, I would highly encourage it. They have a boardwalk. How long is it? A mile long?
Almost 2 miles.
Almost 2 miles long. You go through a forest untouched by human hands, the way nature was originally. And you might encounter anything, but understand, you might be walking down that boardwalk and there's a snake coiled up on the railing, just chilling, sunning itself, or you'll got alligators rolling around down below you. It's beautiful. My daughter's she's in veterinary school now, but she's always been heavily into animals. We went out there, and I wouldn't recommend this part, so I don't know why y'all did that this particular day. In case my wife was with, it would have been terrible if my wife was there. But we walked through the doors, and there's this 10-foot snake just going around on the ground in the lobby. And they just let it out for some exercise. It was non-venomous, of course. But still, you don't expect to turn the corner and go, hey, how you doing?
You must be talking about Lucy.
Yes, Lucy. Why y'all just let Lucy out and
She needs to exercise.
be like a sign on the door, hey, as you're going in, just so you know, Lucy is out on the ground. Because if my wife was with me, I probably wouldn't have a wife now. Yeah, so that was surprising. That was, but it's a beautiful place. Yes, sir.
Kind of reinforcing what Matt said, you mentioned the Dismal Swamp earlier. There's a lot of good archaeological work being done up there, mainly by some of the universities up in Virginia. And they too were looking, just as Matt said, for these parts in the Dismal Swamp that are dry year-round. And what their early discoveries have been was that these maroon communities weren't just staging areas for going further. They weren't temporary respite, but there were permanent communities in them. You know, they're digging up places that look likely and finding structures on top of structures. And new structures replacing burned structures. But apparently, though, a lot of people may come and go, just as the way you were describing earlier, escaping punishment, that sort of thing. Apparently, at least in the Dismal Swamp, there were permanent communities being created.
Yes. So in another case, the governor of South Carolina received information that 107 Negroes had left their plantation and joined a large number of runaways in Colleton County. So they're worried about another full-scale slave rebellion. So the governor sent the militia, but he also brought down 50 Catawba Indians to hunt the runaways. Based on my research, there were a couple of good reasons why Native Americans were necessary and preferred to whites to go after these maroon communities. In a committee report on the boundary between South and North Carolina, it states, and I'll quote exactly as it's written, "It would be convenient and reasonable that the Catawba Indians should be comprehended in the proposed boundary as a very useful body of men to keep our Negroes in some awe. The year 1766 afforded a very strong proof of their utility on such services, for about Christmas 1765, many Negroes, having fled into large swamps and other circumstances concurring, there was great room to apprehend that some dangerous conspiracy and insurrection was intended. And though the militia was ordered on duty and was very alert on this occasion, the governor thought it right to invite a number of Catawba Indians to come down and hunt the Negroes in their different recesses, almost impervious to white people at that season of the year." I love that last line. Basically saying, white people like, yeah, man, I ain't going in there. You're not getting me up in there. Send those Indian people, you know? I'm not about to touch it. But the whole idea of impervious to white people, that's amazing. We just can't do it. I'm sorry, we can't do it. Yes?
Can we define permanent? Is it 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, a generation?
Permanent as in maroon communities?
Yes.
Multiple generations. As long as they can survive. Until slavery, there were still maroon communities during the Civil War that have lasted all the way up to the Civil War, which were no longer necessary, of course, after the Civil War, unless they decided, yeah, we still got better here than in the Jim Crow South. So yes, permanent meant generations of people living in that particular community. And I don't think, it might be one of the pictures later, where you see an actual, looks like a village. It actually looks like a village. They build houses. They plan to be there forever. I like this one, you learn about this one maroon community where anybody ever seen the movie Avatar, the new one, Way of Water? Where they have these little dry areas and they have these little rope bridges like going to the different sections. That's the way it was in some of these maroon communities. So they developed these rope bridges to connect the dry areas. So they're never walking through the swamps themselves. All right. So the Indians immediately came down, and partly by the terror of their name, Catawba, their diligence and singular sagacity. Now I gotta stop there for a minute. This one really threw me. I like when stuff throws me. So allow me to just sit and meditate on this word sagacity for a minute. After I looked it up, figure out what it meant. I didn't know. Anybody know what sagacity means? Yeah, I did not know that. Like, what is sagacity? Because rarely during my studies or teaching about America's westward expansion and our claim to manifest destiny, have I heard European settlers speak about Native American intelligence in such a glowing fashion. Let's face it, much of the European and later American rationale for taking American Indian land because they were mere savages and were not intelligent enough to use the land properly. Now we have a state-sponsored report using a word like sagacity, which is synonymous with words like intelligence, wisdom, and deep insight. Really? So we can talk nice about them when we need them, but the rest of the time, yeah, not so much. All right, let me get back on track. The report said their diligence and singular sagacity in pursuing enemies through such thickets soon dispersed the runaway Negroes, apprehended several, and most of the rest of them chose to surrender themselves to their masters and return to their duty rather than expose themselves to the attack of an enemy so dreaded, so difficult to resist or evade, for which good service the Indians were amply rewarded. There must have been some bad news. You gonna scare me back to my plantation? I'd rather go back to slavery than have to face off against you? That's something else. So this is not the only time South Carolina used Catawba Indians to attack Maroon communities. During the Revolutionary War, a South Carolina company of foot rangers attacked Maroon communities. South Carolina Council on Safety ordered Captain Boykin with 34 Catawba Indians to attack Maroon communities in Dorchester County. Interesting. Never knew that. Don't think about that. You don't think of Revolutionary War, and if you really studied Revolutionary War, you realize it was really won in South Carolina. But people don't want to talk about it. Nathaniel Greene and the boys did their job. Okay, whole different lesson. All right, Revolutionary War continued to contribute to the increase of Maroonage in South Carolina. When the colonists responded to the Stamp Act crisis in 1765, which involved the British raising taxes, really on every piece of paper you can find, American colonists responded with rhetoric about liberty and autonomy. It's believed the slaves learned about those words, like, yeah, we like that, we want some of that. Can I have some of that liberty, that autonomy thing? Do I get some of that? Right? So when the war, South Carolina planter and politician Henry Lawrence commented in early 1766 that some Negroes had mimicked their betters in crying out liberty. How dare they? That's our word, not theirs. They can't use it. In addition, during the Revolutionary War, British authorities created a regiment of Negro troops by offering freedom to runaway slaves. I don't know if you realize this, but between 15 and 20,000 escaped slaves fought with the British during the Revolutionary War. Did y'all know that? Between 15 and 20,000 fought for the British. But we also don't talk about the fact that 5,000 fought with George Washington's army. Now that was later in the war, because when they suggested, hey, we need some more men, we're running out of white dudes. Let's put some on, let's start using some of these Africans. George Washington said, you're not going to use them. You're not even allowed to recruit them. Can't even talk to them. Of course, George Washington was one of the largest slave owners in Virginia, so it's kind of understandable. But near the end of the war, when things got dicey, he's like, yeah, remember that idea you had about black people? Can you give me some of those? And up to 5,000 fought for George Washington's army. If you ever look at, now here's an assignment for you. Go back to that classic, although it's not accurate, but go back to that classic image of Washington crossing the Delaware, right? The Battle of Trenton. Go back to that image and look closely at those boats. You'll see black people in them. Anybody ever realize that before? Notice it. Look in there. You'll see black people in there. There were black people, black patriots, that fought in the Battle of Trenton and went across on those boats with George Washington during the Battle of Trenton on Christmas, the night of Christmas, right? Not Christmas Eve, but the Christmas day at night, right? And that's the same kind of thing when we talk about being surprised that if you look at, we talk about this in class, if you look at that classic image of the Trail of Tears, when the Native Americans are all being marched from Georgia to Oklahoma, 800 to 1,000 miles, when you look at that image, you see a lot of black faces. Why? Because the Cherokee that got forced out of Georgia owned a lot of slaves. And those slaves marched right along with them to that new reservation. Native Americans owned a lot of slaves, in case y'all didn't know that. I love your face. Yeah, they owned a lot of slaves. That's a whole different, yeah, don't get me started. Okay, Lance, I'm gonna keep going. You know how I get in class. I get on the tangent in class, we be somewhere else all the time. All right, I'm almost done, students. You've already earned your credit. I'm almost done, I promise. I'm closing it up now.
Well, this is good.
Thank you, Lance. I appreciate that. Okay, but when the war ended, the British left behind a body of armed blacks who were well trained in military tactics and who had no intention of returning back to bondage. Many of them formed the foundation of Maroonage in the South, which helps explain why they were so difficult to defeat. These were trained soldiers that you're trying to force back into slavery. Like, we've been fighting for years. You're not taking us that easy. So there was a large Maroon community in Beach Hill. Anybody know where Beach Hill is?
Yeah.
Large Maroon community in Beach Hill, just across Bacon's Bridge Road by Beach Hill Elementary School, and what is now the Legend Oaks housing area. If you're familiar with that area. Anybody live in that area? Interesting, learn about the history of that area. Maroons from this community raided Drayton Hall in 1774. A newspaper report on the capture and execution of the ringleader, a Negro man named Caesar, gives a good account of how well-trained Maroons operated and survived. It reads, on Tuesday last week was tried and convicted and executed at Ashley Ferry that notorious offender Caesar, a Negro man-slave, the property of Mr. Daniel Dross of Dorchester, who, with sundry other Negroes, that means different kinds, sundry means a variety, of Negroes as their captain or chief, went from a camp of runaway slaves, a Maroon camp, in or about June of last year with horses, firearms, cutlasses, which is swords, and other dangerous weapons with intent to, and in the night did break open the dwelling of and stores of the Honorable John Drayton Esquire at Drayton Hall in state and carry away thence sugar, rum, bacon, soap, wine, a bale of cloth, and sundry other articles to a very amount, which Caesar carried to the camp at Beach Hill and divided the spoils. So although Maroonage reached its zenith around 1760 to 1830, Maroonage in South Carolina was evidently something that endured for as long as slavery itself existed. Maroons were able in practice to exert control over large areas of land that were effectively beyond white control. They just wasn't going there. In this manner, Maroons in South Carolina were able to gain a degree of autonomy and independence from slavery while never leaving the South. Some black children were born in the swamps and grew up never having known the terrors of slavery or the wrath of masters. Maroonage continued even during the Civil War. A Maroon community attacked near Marion, South Carolina in June 1861. This demonstrated the existence of Maroons up until emancipation. Persistence of Maroonage in South Carolina significantly complicates our understanding of colonial and antebellum slave systems in North America. Thank you for your time and your indulgence. Are there any questions? Yes?
Where was Hutchinson's store?
It was right on Highway 17. There's a historic, and I haven't been to this historic market, and it is called Pompon Road, not Pompon Road, Pompon Chapel. If anybody know where that is?
Yeah.
And my understanding is the store was right around there. And a friend of mine told me that there's a historic marker for the store that I haven't found yet. Anybody know where that marker is? Seen that marker? So I need to discover that myself so I can go to that site. But that's the area. I was out there a couple weeks ago just searching around, and they have the Stono State Park or whatever the little park is there. You can actually go out into the big little boardwalk. So out there, so you kind of get an idea of what those marshes and those swamps look like out there. And I finally discovered when I walked out there, whenever I watched, this is a video series I use in my class from Dr. Henry Louis Gates, and he talks about the Maroons, and he's in South Carolina, walking around South Carolina. And in the video, I'm like, where is that place where he's standing at? Like, I wanna find it, where is that? So I never figured out where he was, and then I walked out into that state park, and I turned around and looked, hey, this is where he was. So I took some pictures out there, yes.
Stonehouse State Park?
Yeah, it's in West Ashley, on Highway 17, right where, I don't think it's called Stonehouse State Park. Matter of fact, I got a picture, so I can tell you exactly what it's called. Let's see exactly what it's called. I took a picture of the sign. Let's see. There we go. Stono River County Park. Yeah. Stono River County Park. Yes.
Bedford Plantation. You know where that is?
I do not.
I've been looking for it myself.
Sorry, I wish I could.
Dr. West challenged me to find out where it is.
Yeah.
He didn't know, but I think I have an inclination that Bedford is where Lake Moultrie is. They flooded
I used
it.
to work out there. Yeah,
They flooded
that makes
it.
sense.
So that's why nobody knows it. But what was interesting was all the slaves in this area were owned by widowed white females. And they had whipping stations. And they took the slaves, the chief slave, and they would get the guys that weren't working like they were supposed to, and they would take them by wagon up near Four Hole Swamp to a whipping station out in the woods. So I've been trying to chase all that information down.
Well, if you find out anything, let the museum know so they can
Yeah,
let me know.
I haven't been successful.
Because, matter of fact, my family, like, my last name is Scarlett. My great-grandfather Levi was owned by the Scarlett sisters in Durham, North Carolina. And so my cousin over there was a judge. Well, she just retired from being a judge in North Carolina. She has an actual copy of the receipt, bill of sale.
Yeah.
When these sisters who didn't have husbands needed help, so they purchased my great-grandfather Levi. But the cool part about it, though, is that they left him 150 acres of land after he was emancipated. And so I got to go down there and sell some of that land. It was still in the family. When my dad was dying, he's like, look, it's 5 of y'all, giving you an assignment, sell the land, divide the money. It wasn't a whole, we only had 11 acres out of the 150, so there's a lot of family members that had them, so. And we sold it to Eno State Park, they wanted to expand the park down there. So but it's just interesting, it's creepy, but interesting at the same time, too, because so few of us really know where our names come from. Right? So it's nice to know. And my cousin, like I said, the judge up there, she has a good relationship with the white Scarlets there now. You know, they compare notes on the history of those sisters and so forth, so, you know, they're friends now. Any other questions? Yes?
Yeah, the conditions in a maroon community must have been very harsh. Do you have any idea what the mortality rate would have been?
I don't, but that's a good question. But the mortality rate on plantations wasn't that good either. You know, when you think about it, what's better? I'd rather die at 50 years old a free man than at 75 a slave.
Well, why do you think the Catawba Indians were like the Republican Guards?
Why?
Why? Because they were so mad at us at bringing them the disease, the pox.
And but not just that though. I'm sure that's a huge part of it. Because if you don't know, this is something that always blows the mind of my students, that within 100 years of Columbus's first voyage, and he never made it to America, in case you don't know that. Closest he got was the Bahamas. Bahamas and Cuba. Within 100 years of his first voyage, 90% of American Indians were dead. Disease. 90% of the American Indian population was dead within that first 100 years after that first ship of Europeans came to America.
Excuse me, there's a very good book, it's called 1493. And it's really good. It just talks about the ramifications of finding the New World, but around the whole
ramification,
world. But around the whole world, it affected everything.
Yeah, we talk about it in class as the Columbian Exchange. And because there is, can you imagine America, matter of fact, it makes me think about what I had for lunch today. America without cows, without pigs. Does that sound like America that you even imagine? That all came over through the Columbian Exchange. We didn't have those animals here. We didn't have horses, they came from Spain. Yeah, I'm not sure about chickens. They may have came, there were a lot of chickens in Africa. But just a lot of the things that we have now, and we think about Ireland. What product we think about with Ireland? Potatoes. They didn't have potatoes. That came from here in the Columbian Exchange over to Europe. They never heard of potato before. And it became their whole society, which we saw with the Great Potato Famine, which took out millions of the Irish. So yes, there's positives and negatives to that legacy. I still don't understand why we celebrate Columbus Day, but you'll never convince me.
That's a very good question.
You'll never convince me, because if you read, the first letter that Columbus sent from when he met the Taino, that's where they were, the Taino Indians in the Bahamas. He sent back this glowing report on these fantastic people. They are so friendly. They give us these great gifts. They're fabulous people. We can enslave them with only a few dozen people. That's the letter he sent back. They're so nice that we'll be easily take them over. And which, he gave a few of them a tour of their ship. And when they came back up on deck, they were out at sea. Took them back to Spain for enslavement. Yeah, here's a gift to you. So yeah, that history is horrible. If you ever read the actual history of Columbus's time in the New World, it is horrible. So much so that there's a priest, can't think of his name for a second. What's his name, Jacob? The priest that wrote against Columbus. De las Casas.
De las Casas.
Yeah, De las Casas. A priest that wrote back to the empire going, look, we are a Christian nation. What's going on here is not Christ-like. You need to stop this. You need to recall Columbus and his people. What they are doing to these people here is not Christian conduct. Because they sold the voyage as we're going to make Christians out of the people that we discover and spread the love of Christ. That ain't what he spread at all. Any other questions?
Recommended reading?
Oh, there is a, I don't know if you're ready for this one.
What's the main book that you mentioned that this research was based on?
Actually, I have it with me. The Maroons of South Carolina. Okay. Maroon Communities in South Carolina. That's the name of the book. By Timothy James Lockley. There's a book called Stamped from the Beginning. And it tells you the story of how from the first day that Africans arrived in America, they were stamped as inferior. And it tells a story of how they were utilized in America throughout that time period. Very controversial. It's one of those books that they held up in Congress saying it should be banned. Students should not be allowed to read this book. So when I got my new job, I asked for the book. But then I had to back off. I got a nicer book. A nicer book. But that's a powerful book. Another great thing to read is the 1619 Project. If you, that's, I don't know if y'all remember, that's one of those things that when Donald Trump was president, he banned any mention of that in the American school system, 1619 Project. Because the focus of the 1619 Project is just very scholarly. Let me show you how America profited from bringing in slaves. The first slaves were brought into America on a ship called the White Lion in 1619 into the Jamestown settlement to pick tobacco, right? And so from that time to the present, it just lays out how America benefited. Because a lot of people don't realize that the New York Stock Exchange used to be the New York Cotton Exchange. That's how America financed its beginnings. A lot of people don't realize that the majority of slave ships that went to Africa to capture slaves did not leave the South. They were built and they left New England. New England was the capital of the slave trade for America as far as building ships and going over there, because they were taking the rum that they created in New England over to Africa. That was the currency used to buy slaves. And then taking those slaves to the Caribbean islands, mainly places like Jamaica, Barbados, Bahamas. Those weren't black islands originally. You go to Caribbean today, you think they've always been black islands. No, they weren't. Those are the descendants of slaves on all those islands. And they also, but when they got there, they were seasoned. What does that mean? They were seasoned. So basically, they were tortured until they accepted their status as slaves. So that's where they would beat them into submission before they can sell them to other places. It's like breaking a horse. It's like breaking a horse. So they took them there. We call it triangular trade. All right.
Yeah.
All right. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am. Steve, y'all don't have to stick around through the questions. You already earned y'all credit. Y'all good.
I'm Pat Gerwig. I'm on the board, and just want to thank y'all for coming. But I want to share something because what you've said today, for some reason to me, links to a trip my husband and I took about 5 years ago to Ripley, Ohio. Now, Ripley sits on the bluff of the Ohio River, about 1,000 feet up. On the Ohio side, across the river, is Kentucky. Kentucky was a slave state. Ripley was a free state. On the bluff lived John Ripley, who was a minister. He was also a station on the Underground Railroad. One of the most impressive things I've ever seen is if you could get across the river and up the 1,000 feet to his house, he would transport you on the Underground Railroad. He had like 13 kids. Kids rotated who did the transport. And a transport was 5 miles because that's all you could travel in the dark, was 5 miles. And he would he had a shotgun by his front door because if the bounty hunters came and they found a fugitive, he was subject to lose everything he had. So it is one of the most impressive things I have ever seen. For one, for people to even bother to try to do it. And then for someone to be there waiting for them to help them move on. It's just,
It is so important to understand the role that good-hearted white people played in every successful endeavor of the Underground Railroad, even the, which we talk, come on, brain, the slave rebellion led by Denmark Vesey and Denmark Vesey rebellion in downtown Charleston. When we talk about the 39 people who were hanged after that rebellion and punished for that rebellion, it included 4 whites that were integral in the planning and helping him out. So I always try to emphasize this was not just a land of angry white people taking advantage of blacks. No, only, and this is a number that surprised me, as I grew up in Philly. We thought all y'all owned slaves, right? Period. So when I learned that in America, on average, only 25% of white families own slaves. Mainly because the others couldn't afford it. That's a big part of it. But only 25% own slaves. 49% in South Carolina. But only 25% on average. So it's not like everybody owns slaves. And so there were probably a lot more abolitionists than there were slave owners. So when we do this thing together as Americans, it can be a beautiful thing. When we help each other out, it can be a beautiful thing. When you stop looking at the color of somebody's skin, it can be a beautiful thing. Great things happen when that happens. We look past that and just work together. Yes, that's just a wish. I have a dream.
No, it's happening. It's happening.